He knelt on the pavement, glass scattered around his boots, and gently wrapped the broken pieces in a napkin so she wouldn't get hurt. Minutes earlier, 3 strangers had laughed at the way she talked, the way she moved, until they saw the look on his face and scattered into the crowd. Nobody in that town expected the tattooed man on the motorcycle to be the one who knelt down first. Nobody expected him to be the gentle one. 3 months earlier, she had walked up to him at a bakery table where he always sat alone and asked him a question nobody else had bothered to ask. What she said next would end up changing both of their lives, and nobody who witnessed it that morning ever looked at either of them the same way again. The bell above the door of Coleman's Corner Bakery rang at exactly 7:15 every morning, and every morning it announced the same man. Marcus Whitfield walked in wearing the same black leather jacket regardless of the season, his forearms wrapped in faded tattoos that told stories nobody in Asheville had ever asked to hear. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and sat at the table nearest the window, the one furthest from everyone else. Nobody sat near Marcus. It wasn't a rule anyone had written down, but it was understood the way small towns understand things without saying them out loud. He had moved to Asheville 3 years earlier, bought a rundown garage on the edge of downtown, and turned it into a custom motorcycle shop. He kept his head down, paid his bills on time, and spoke only when spoken to. That should have been enough. It wasn't. Rumors filled the space where facts should have been. Someone said he'd been in prison. Someone else said he'd been dishonorably discharged from the army after some kind of incident nobody could name. The truth was simpler and heavier than any of it. Marcus had served 2 tours overseas, come home to an empty apartment and a marriage that hadn't survived the distance, and settled in a town where he knew no one on purpose. Solitude wasn't a punishment to him. It was the only thing that felt safe. Sam Coleman, who owned the bakery, was one of the few people who treated Marcus like a regular customer instead of a curiosity. He never asked questions, just poured the coffee and let the man sit in peace. It was Sam who had hired Grace Bennett 6 months earlier, after her mother asked around town for anyone willing to give her a chance. Grace was 26 years old. With short brown hair, she kept pinned back with a yellow clip and a laugh that carried through the whole bakery when something struck her as funny. She had Down syndrome, and she had spent most of her life being underestimated by people who decided who she was before they ever spoke to her. She wiped down tables, restocked napkins, and greeted every customer by name once she learned it, which she usually did within a day or 2. She had never learned Marcus's name because Marcus had never offered it, and nobody else in the bakery said much to him either. For weeks, Grace watched him from behind the counter. She noticed the way he stared out the window instead of at his phone, like everyone else. She noticed he always left exact change and never made eye contact with the other customers. She noticed, most of all, that he ate breakfast alone every single day, the same way she sometimes felt alone in rooms full of people who talked around her instead of to her. Her mother, Karen Bennett, had warned her more than once to be careful around strangers, especially ones who looked like Marcus. It wasn't meant unkindly. Karen had spent 26 years protecting her daughter from a world that hadn't always been gentle with her. Kids who mocked her in school, adults who spoke slower and louder than necessary, as if volume could fix understanding, strangers who stared too long or not at all. Karen's caution came from love, but it had also taught Grace to measure people by their kindness rather than their appearance, because she knew exactly what it felt like to be judged by a first impression. One Tuesday morning, business was slow, and Grace found herself standing near Marcus's table longer than she meant to. He looked up, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You're always alone," Grace said. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply true, the way she said most things. Marcus set down his coffee cup. "Guess I am," he said. "I'm alone a lot too," Grace said. People don't always know what to say to me, so they don't say anything. Marcus studied her for a long moment, the way he might study a stranger's face for signs of threat, an old habit from years he didn't talk about. He found none, just a woman looking at him with more patience than most people managed after knowing him for months. "That happened to you a lot?" "And he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Sometimes," Grace said, shrugging, "but I still like to try." She smiled at him, the same open smile she gave every customer, and went back to wiping down the counter. Marcus watched her go, something unfamiliar shifting behind his ribs, not quite comfort, not quite curiosity, but close to both. He finished his coffee slower than usual that morning, and when he left, he found himself glancing back at the bakery window before he started his bike. He told himself it meant nothing. He believed it for exactly 6 more days. That night, back at the shop that doubled as his apartment, Marcus sat on the small couch pushed against the wall of the garage's back room and found himself thinking about the conversation more than he wanted to admit. He'd built a life out of avoiding exactly this kind of thing. Small talk, curiosity, the slow creep of another person wanting to know him. It was easier to be a stranger in every room he entered. Strangers didn't ask questions that led anywhere painful. Strangers didn't stay long enough to notice the things he'd rather keep buried, but Grace hadn't asked him anything painful. She'd simply noticed he was alone, the same plain observation anyone might make about the weather, and moved on without demanding an explanation. There had been no pity in her voice, no careful softness reserved for someone people considered damaged. She had spoken to him the way she apparently spoke to everyone, and something about that plainness had gotten past defenses 3 years of silence had built brick by brick. He thought, too, about how rarely anyone in Asheville looked him directly in the eye. Most people's gazes slid past him on the sidewalk or dropped to the pavement when he passed, the practiced avoidance of people who'd already decided what kind of man wore that many tattoos and rode that kind of motorcycle. Grace had looked at him steadily the whole time, waiting for him to answer, instead of assuming she already knew what he'd say. The next morning, he found himself dressing a few minutes earlier than usual, telling himself it had nothing to do with wanting to get to the bakery before the morning rush. By the second week, Grace had started saying good morning to Marcus by name, though she'd had to ask Sam for it first. Marcus, in turn, had started nodding back instead of staring past her. It wasn't friendship yet, not really, but it was more than either of them had shared with anyone in a long time. The town noticed before Marcus did. Diane Foster, who lived 2 houses down from the Bennetts and had known Grace since she was a little girl in pigtails, mentioned it to Karen one afternoon while they stood on adjoining porches. "That biker's been talking to Grace at the bakery," Diane said, keeping her voice light in a way that didn't quite hide her concern. "Robert know about that?" Karen felt something tighten in her chest, the reflex of 26 years spent anticipating danger before it arrived. "I'll ask her about it," she said, and she did, that same evening over dinner. "He's nice, Mom," Grace said simply, cutting her chicken into careful pieces the way she always did. "He doesn't talk much, but when he does, he listens." "Nice men don't usually look like that," Robert Bennett said from the head of the table, not unkindly, but firmly. Robert had worked construction for 20 years and had seen his share of rough men who turned out exactly as rough as they looked. He wasn't wrong to be cautious. He was wrong, though he didn't know it yet, about Marcus. "You don't know what he looks like on the inside," Grace said, and the table went quiet, because it was the kind of thing Grace said sometimes that made grown adults feel like they were the ones who needed the lesson. Meanwhile, at the bakery, the conversations between Grace and Marcus had grown longer, though never long. She told him about her job, about the community center where she took a pottery class on Thursdays, about her older brother, who lived 2 states away and called every Sunday. Marcus mostly listened, offering short replies about his shop, about a dog he used to have, about nothing that touched too close to the years he still didn't talk about. One morning, Grace arrived at the bakery with a small clay bowl she'd made in her pottery class, uneven and lopsided, but glazed a deep forest green. She set it on Marcus's table without asking. "I made this for you," she said. "You always look like you need something nice." Marcus turned the bowl over in his hands, rougher hands than the delicate object deserved, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't know what to say. "Nobody's given me anything in a long time," he admitted. "Now somebody has," Grace said, and went back to work like she hadn't just cracked something open in him that he'd kept sealed for years. The friendship didn't stay quiet for long. A regular customer, a man named Curtis Doyle, who came in most mornings for a bagel, made a comment loud enough for half the bakery to hear. "Somebody ought to tell that girl's parents what kind of company she's keeping," he said to no one in particular, though clearly meant for everyone to hear. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Grace, however, turned around from the counter, unbothered in a way that surprised everyone in the room. "He's my friend," she said plainly. "You don't have to like it. You just have to be polite about it." Curtis had no answer for that. Sam Coleman, wiping down the espresso machine, hid a smile behind his hand. But word traveled fast in a town the size of Asheville's older neighborhoods, and by the end of the week, Robert Bennett had heard enough second-hand concern to decide he needed to see this Marcus Whitfield for himself. He drove to the bakery on a Thursday afternoon, parked his truck across the street from the motorcycle shop, and walked in without an invitation. Marcus looked up from the engine he was rebuilding, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better days. "Can I help you?" he asked, though something in Robert's expression told him exactly who this was and exactly why he'd come. "You've been spending time with my daughter," Robert said. No preamble, no softness. "She's been spending time with me," Marcus corrected quietly. "I never asked her to." "That's supposed to make me feel better." Marcus set down the rag and looked Robert directly in the eye, something he rarely did with anyone. "I don't have an answer that'll make you feel better," he said. "All I can tell you is, I've never once said an unkind word to her, and I never will. That's the truth, whether you believe it or not." Robert studied him for a long moment, searching for the danger he'd been warned about, and found instead a man standing very still, holding himself with the careful restraint of someone who had learned, the hard way, exactly how much damage his size and his history could do if he ever let his guard down. It wasn't proof of anything, but it wasn't nothing either. His eyes drifted across the workbench, the neat rows of tools, a folded flag in a glass case on a shelf near the register, a single photograph tacked to a corkboard of a much younger Marcus standing beside two other soldiers, all three of them squinting into a bright desert sun. Robert had spent enough years around working men to recognize the difference between someone who kept a messy shop out of laziness and someone who kept an immaculate one because order was the only thing left he could control. "That your unit?" Robert asked, nodding toward the photograph, his voice a little less hard than before. "Two of them didn't make it home," Marcus said. He didn't elaborate, and Robert didn't ask him to. Some things men understood without needing the whole story spelled out. "My daughter doesn't make friends easy," Robert said instead, changing course. "People talk around her more than they talk to her, has her whole life. So when she tells me somebody talks to her like a person, I'm supposed to just trust that." "You don't have to trust me," Marcus said. "You can watch. I'd rather you watch and see the truth than take my word for it." Robert nodded slowly, something in his posture easing, though not fully. "I'll be watching," he said, which was as close to permission as he was willing to give that day, and walked back out to his truck without another word. He sat behind the wheel for a full minute before starting the engine, turning over the photograph in his mind, the folded flag, the way the man hadn't once raised his voice. The watching didn't stop with Robert. Over the following weeks, it seemed like half of Asheville had an opinion about Grace Bennett and the tattooed man from the motorcycle shop, and almost none of those opinions had been formed by anyone who'd actually spoken to Marcus. The community center, where Grace took her Thursday pottery class, became one of the first places the whispering reached her directly. A woman named Patricia, whose daughter also attended the class, cornered Grace by the supply shelves one afternoon. "Sweetie, I just want to make sure you're being careful," Patricia said, in the overly gentle voice some people used with Grace that she had long ago learned to recognize and dislike. "Men like that can be dangerous. You understand what I mean?" "You don't know him," Grace said, gripping a bag of clay a little tighter than necessary. "You just know what he looks like." "I know enough," Patricia said. "You know less than me," Grace answered, and walked away before the conversation could continue, her hands shaking slightly the way they did when she felt cornered by people who spoke to her like she couldn't understand her own life. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Grace didn't want to talk about her day at dinner. Karen noticed immediately, a mother always does, and found her daughter sitting on the porch steps afterward, staring out at nothing in particular. "People think I don't understand things," Grace said quietly. "They think because of how I am, I can't tell who's good and who isn't. But I can tell. I've always been able to tell. Marcus is good. I don't understand why nobody believes me." Karen sat down beside her daughter, the porch light casting long shadows across the yard. She thought about all the years she'd spent trying to shield Grace from a world that too often decided her daughter's worth before it ever got to know her, and she felt, for the first time, the uncomfortable recognition that she might have been doing the very same thing to someone else. "Maybe I should meet him properly," Karen said, "not just your father standing in his shop making threats." Grace looked up, surprised. "You'd do that?" "I raised a daughter who trusts her own judgment," Karen said. "Maybe it's time I trusted it too." Karen visited the motorcycle shop 3 days later, alone, without telling Robert beforehand. She found Marcus exactly where Grace had described him, hunched over a workbench, focused, quiet, surrounded by tools organized with more care than most people gave their own homes. He looked up when the bell over his door rang, and something in his posture straightened, the way people brace themselves for confrontation they've come to expect. "Mrs. Bennett," he said. He knew her from Grace's stories before she'd ever introduced herself. "I wanted to see for myself," Karen said honestly. "Not what people say about you, what you actually are." Marcus set down his tools. "Ask me anything," he said. "I won't lie to you." They talked for nearly an hour. Karen asked about his time in the service, and Marcus answered plainly, without exaggeration or excuse, describing 2 tours that had cost him more than most people ever saw on the surface, friends he'd lost, a marriage that had crumbled under the weight of distance and things he couldn't explain to someone who hadn't been there. He talked about how he'd found Asheville almost by accident, looking for a place quiet enough to rebuild something resembling a life. "Grace was the first person in 3 years who talked to me like I wasn't something to be afraid of," he admitted. "I didn't ask for that. I didn't think I deserved it. But she gave it to me anyway." Karen listened, and somewhere in the honesty of his voice, in the careful way he spoke about her daughter, never once condescending, never once treating Grace as anything less than a person with her own mind and her own choices, she recognized something she hadn't expected to find. "She sees people clearly," Karen said finally. "Clearer than most of us, most days." "I know," Marcus said. "It's the first time in a long time somebody's seen me clearly too." Karen left the shop that afternoon with more questions answered than she'd arrived with, and one new certainty settling in her chest. The town had decided who Marcus Whitfield was, without ever really looking at him, the same way it had spent years deciding who her daughter was, without ever really listening to her. The two people everyone in Asheville had underestimated had found each other, and neither of them needed anyone else's permission to be exactly who they were. She just hadn't figured out yet how to convince the rest of the town. Driving home, Karen replayed the conversation, turning over one detail in particular that had stayed with her more than the rest. She had asked Marcus, almost as an afterthought, why he'd never corrected any of the rumors circulating about him. The whispers about prison, about dishonorable discharge, about whatever dark history people had invented to explain a quiet man on a motorcycle. Marcus had shrugged, an old, tired gesture. "People believe what's easiest," he'd said. "Explaining myself to folks who already made up their minds never seemed worth the breath. Grace never needed an explanation. She just watched and decided for herself." That answer had stayed with Karen the rest of the drive home, long after the shop had disappeared from her rearview mirror. She thought about how much energy she had spent over the years correcting people's assumptions about her daughter. The doctors who spoke about Grace's limitations before ever meeting her, the school teachers who assumed less than Grace was capable of, the strangers in grocery stores who talked to Karen instead of to Grace herself, as though her daughter couldn't answer for herself. Karen had fought that battle 1,000 times over, and yet here she was, having needed a full conversation to convince herself that a man in a leather jacket wasn't dangerous simply because he looked the part. That evening she told Robert everything: the photograph on the corkboard, the folded flag, the careful way Marcus spoke about their daughter, never once with the condescension so many people carried without realizing it. Robert listened without interrupting, his jaw working the way it did when he was turning something over that didn't sit easily. "I still want to see it for myself," he said finally. "But I hear you." "That's all I'm asking," Karen said. The confrontation that finally shifted things happened on a Saturday morning that started like any other and ended with half of downtown Asheville watching Marcus Whitfield do something none of them expected. Grace had gone to the farmer's market alone, something she did most weekends, walking the 3 blocks from her apartment building with a canvas bag over her shoulder and a list of what her mother needed for Sunday dinner. She knew the vendors, knew which stall sold the good tomatoes, knew to avoid the honey stand run by a man who always shorted his change. It was a routine she was proud of, one more piece of independence she'd fought hard to earn. That morning, a group of teenagers, 3 boys who didn't know her and clearly didn't care to, decided her way of speaking and moving through the market was something to laugh at. It started small, a mimicked gesture, a snickered comment just loud enough for her to hear, the kind of casual cruelty that people sometimes extend toward anyone who moves through the world differently than they do. Grace tried to keep walking, the way she'd learned to over 26 years, but one of the boys stepped directly into her path, exaggerating her voice in a way that made the other 2 laugh harder. She dropped her canvas bag. A jar of honey shattered on the pavement. Marcus had been 3 stalls down, picking up a bag of coffee beans from a vendor he liked, when he heard the laughter shift into something sharper. He turned and saw Grace, standing frozen, her face flushed with the particular humiliation of being mocked in public, tomatoes rolling across the ground at her feet. He didn't shout. He didn't grab anyone. He simply walked over, knelt down, and began picking up the spilled groceries, placing them carefully back into the bag as if nothing else in the market mattered in that moment. "You okay?" he asked Grace quietly, his voice steady in a way that seemed to absorb some of the tension crackling in the air around them. "I'm fine," Grace said, though her voice shook slightly. Marcus stood, and for the first time, the boys got a full look at him. The tattoos, the height, the stillness of someone who had faced far worse than 3 teenagers with nothing better to do on a Saturday morning. He didn't threaten them. He didn't need to. "You've had your laugh," he said evenly. "Time to move along." The boys, suddenly less confident than they'd been moments earlier, mumbled something and scattered into the crowd. A small circle of onlookers had gathered by then, drawn by the commotion, including Diane Foster, who had been buying peaches 2 stalls away and had seen the entire thing unfold. What people remembered afterward, and what got repeated across Asheville for weeks, wasn't the confrontation itself. It was what happened next. Marcus knelt back down, gathered the last of the spilled tomatoes, and then gently helped Grace pick up the shattered glass so she wouldn't cut herself, wrapping the pieces carefully in a napkin from his own pocket. "They didn't have the right to do that," he said, still kneeling beside her. "People don't always know how to be kind," Grace said, echoing something she'd told him weeks earlier in the bakery when he'd been the lonely one. "Some people don't try hard enough to learn," Marcus said. He walked her the rest of the way through the market, carrying her bag, and then walked her the 3 blocks home, saying nothing more about what had happened, simply staying close enough that she didn't have to feel alone in the aftermath of it. Diane Foster told Karen about it before Grace even got through the front door. By evening, half the neighborhood had heard some version of the story, and for the first time, the narrative that traveled through Asheville wasn't about a dangerous man near a vulnerable young woman. It was about a man who had knelt on the pavement, wrapped broken glass in his own napkin, and made sure a woman everyone else had been quick to judge got home safely. Robert Bennett heard the story from Diane directly, standing in his own driveway, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he got in his truck and drove to the motorcycle shop for the second time in a month. Marcus looked up when the bell rang, bracing himself again out of habit. "I heard what happened," Robert said. "She's fine," Marcus said immediately. "Just shaken up." "I know," Robert said. "Diane told me everything, what you did." He paused, searching for words that didn't come easily to him. "I judged you before I knew you. That wasn't fair." Marcus set down his tools, the same way he had for Karen weeks earlier. "Most people do," he said, without bitterness. "I've stopped expecting different." "Maybe you shouldn't have to anymore," Robert said, and extended his hand. Marcus looked at it for a moment before he shook it, something loosening in his chest that had been tight for longer than 3 years. "For what it's worth," Robert added, still gripping his hand. "Karen told me about your service. About your unit. I should have asked about that before I ever assumed anything else about you." "Most people don't ask," Marcus said. "It's easier to guess." "Guessing's how people like me end up wrong," Robert admitted. He glanced around the shop again, this time not searching for danger but simply looking, taking in the neat rows of tools, the folded flag, the small green bowl sitting on the corner of the workbench, chipped slightly at the rim but clearly cared for. "Grace made that?" "Pottery class," Marcus said. "First gift anybody's given me in 3 years." Robert was quiet for a moment. "She's got good instincts," he said. "Better than most of us, if I'm honest. Took me a public scene at the farmer's market to see what she already knew the first week she met you." "She saw something worth seeing," Marcus said. "I'm just glad somebody finally believed her." Robert nodded, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door weeks earlier ready for a confrontation, he found himself simply standing in a stranger's shop with nothing left to defend against. "Sunday dinner," Robert said abruptly, as though the words had escaped before he fully decided to say them. "Karen makes a roast most weeks. You should come." Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the invitation. "I wouldn't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be intruding," Robert said. "You'd be coming because my daughter asked you to be her friend, and you didn't run the other way, like everybody else in this town might have. That earns you a seat at the table, far as I'm concerned." Autumn settled over Asheville slowly that year, the mountains turning shades of orange and red that drew tourists from 3 states over, and by the time the leaves began to fall, Marcus Whitfield had become a fixture at the Bennett family's Sunday dinners. It hadn't happened all at once. Robert's handshake outside the motorcycle shop had opened a door, but it was Grace, as it had been from the very beginning, who walked everyone else through it. She invited Marcus to dinner the following Sunday without asking her parents first, the way she'd learned to trust her own instincts even when the world around her suggested she shouldn't. Karen set an extra plate without comment. Robert, gruff as ever, asked Marcus about his motorcycle shop and found himself an hour later genuinely interested in the answer. By dessert, the conversation had turned easy in a way none of them had expected, and when Marcus offered to help clear the table, Karen waved him off and told him guests didn't do dishes, the first time in years anyone had called him a guest instead of a stranger to be tolerated. The town took longer to come around than the family had, but it came around all the same. Curtis Doyle, the man who'd made the comment in the bakery weeks earlier, stopped in at Marcus's shop that October to get his own motorcycle serviced, an unspoken apology neither of them mentioned out loud. Patricia, from the pottery class, brought her daughter by the bakery one morning and let her sit at Grace's recommendation, in the seat 2 tables down from Marcus, close enough to prove she no longer saw him as a threat. Grace kept working at the bakery, kept taking her pottery class on Thursdays, kept greeting every customer by name within a day or two of meeting them. But something had shifted in how the town looked at her too. The whispers about her limitations had quieted, replaced by something closer to what her mother had always known. That Grace understood people better than most of them understood themselves. That her judgment about who deserved trust had been right from the very first morning she asked Marcus if he was always alone. Marcus changed too, in ways that were harder to see from the outside, but unmistakable to the people who knew him now. He still didn't talk much about his years overseas, but he'd started talking about them at all, in small pieces, first to Grace, then eventually to Robert over a beer on the back porch, then once, briefly, to a support group for veterans that met at the community center on Tuesday evenings, the same building where Grace took her pottery class 2 days later. He kept the lopsided green bowl Grace had made him on the workbench in his shop, where every customer who came in could see it, a small piece of proof that somebody had once looked at him and decided he was worth something nice. One morning in late October, Grace arrived at the bakery to find Marcus already there, sitting at his usual table, but for the first time at a table built for 2 instead of 1. "I saved you a seat," he said, and Grace sat down across from him instead of behind the counter, taking her morning break for the first time in months to simply talk instead of work. "You're not alone anymore," Grace said. "Neither are you," Marcus answered. They sat together for the better part of an hour that morning, longer than either of them had planned, talking about small things the way people do once the big things have already been settled between them. Grace told him about a new piece she was working on in pottery class, a mug this time instead of a bowl, and how she planned to paint it blue because blue was Marcus's favorite color, something she'd noticed from the color of his motorcycle without ever having to ask. "You pay attention to things most people don't bother noticing," Marcus said. "I like noticing things," Grace said. "People think that means I don't understand as much as they do, but I think it means I understand more, sometimes. I notice when somebody's sad even when they're smiling. I noticed you were sad the very first day I saw you in here." Marcus turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, considering that. "I didn't think it showed." "It always shows," Grace said. "People just don't look long enough to see it." Sam Coleman came by with the coffee pot, refilling both their cups without being asked, and lingered a moment longer than necessary. He'd watched the whole thing unfold from behind his counter over the past several months, the cautious nods that became conversations, the conversations that became a friendship the whole town had eventually stopped questioning. "Never seen this place feel more like it was supposed to," he said, before heading back to the register, leaving the 2 of them to their morning. Later that week, the local paper ran a small feature on the farmers' market incident, framed not around the teenagers who had mocked Grace, but around what Marcus had done afterward, kneeling on the pavement, wrapping broken glass so carefully in his own napkin. The reporter had interviewed 6 people, including Diane Foster, who described what she'd witnessed with more warmth than she'd ever shown Marcus directly. The article didn't mention his service record or his past, only what people had seen with their own eyes. A man who had chosen gentleness when he had every excuse to choose anger. Marcus read the article once, folded the newspaper carefully, and left it on his workbench next to the green bowl. He didn't need the recognition. He'd stopped needing that from anyone the day he came home from his second tour and realized the only approval that had ever mattered much to him was his own. But it mattered in a smaller way that people in Asheville were finally willing to see him as something other than the assumptions they'd built without his permission. By Thanksgiving, the Bennett family's table had grown by one permanent chair. Karen no longer set an extra plate as a courtesy, she simply set the table for 5. Robert had taken to calling Marcus most Saturdays to help with projects around the house, an excuse they both understood without saying so, to spend time together that had nothing to do with checking up on anyone. Grace still asked people if she could be their friend, unbothered by rejection when it came, unchanged by the acceptance that had followed with Marcus. It was, Karen realized one evening, watching her daughter laugh at something across the dinner table, the simplest and bravest thing Grace had ever taught any of them. That judgment based on appearance said far more about the person doing the judging than the person being judged. Marcus kept the shop running, kept the green bowl on his workbench where every customer could see it, and kept showing up at the bakery every morning at 7:15, though now there were 2 cups of coffee waiting at the table instead of 1. He'd spent 3 years building a life around being invisible, and it had taken one honest question from a woman nobody else had bothered to really see, to remind him that being seen wasn't the danger he'd convinced himself it was. It had been all along exactly what both of them needed. Outside the bakery window, Asheville moved through its ordinary Tuesday morning, unaware that inside, 2 people the town had once measured entirely by their appearances, one too rough to trust, one too different to understand, had quietly become each other's proof that judgment based on looks alone would always, eventually be wrong. Grace had asked a simple question months earlier, one that most people would have been too cautious or too proud to ask a stranger. "Can I be your friend?" The answer, it turned out, had changed both of their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted, and had quietly changed the way an entire town saw 2 people it had never really taken the time to know.